Just a couple things here real quick. On Thursday, January 21st, we have Steve Inskeep's Imperfect Union. He'll be in conversation with Claiborne Barksdale. On Monday, the 25th, Ed Tarkington's The Fortunate Ones. He'll be in conversation with our manager, Len Roberts. And on Wednesday, the 27th, B. Brian Foster's I Don't Like the Blues, Race, Place, and the Backbeat of Black Life. He'll be in conversation with William Ferris. And due to COVID, as y'all know, we have not been holding readings or other events. And some of you noticed we did not have our traditional public group reading of MLK's letter from Birmingham jail Saturday. And we do plan on doing this. And we're going to do it February 1st at 5 p.m. It's usually about a 45-minute event. We encourage y'all to join us. It's always a good one. And email us at books@squarebooks.com if you would like to be a reader. So I'd like to present H.R. McMaster, the Fuad and Michelle Ajami Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institute and Stanford University. He's also the Susan and Bernard Leopold Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute and lecturer at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. He serves as chairman of the advisory board of the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and the Japan Chair at the Hudson Institute. A native of Philadelphia, HR graduated from West Point in 1984. He served as a U.S. Army officer for 34 years and retired as Lieutenant General in 2018. He remained on active duty while serving as the 26th Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. He taught history at West Point and holds a PhD in history from UNC Chapel Hill. And Wright Thompson, whom most of y'all know, is a senior writer for ESPN and the best-selling author of Pappyland and the Cost of These Dreams. HR is here with his book, of course, Battlegrounds. Fantastic book, great and enlightening read. So without further ado, here are the couple. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Beckett. It's a pleasure to be here. HR, thanks so much for your time and for joining us here in Oxford, Mississippi. I read this twice now, and I have a lot of questions. I mean, first, it's a little terrifying to understand what's going on out in the world. I'm glad that there are folks like you who are responsible and not me. I'm going to stick to writing about football. The thing I wanted to start with is, in the preface of your book, when talking about sort of its reasons for being, you talked about how there was a lot of pressure from people to either confirm their worst suspicions about the president, the soon-to-be outgoing president, or to confirm their faith in him. And that, you were more interested, and I'm quoting from the book, I wanted to write a book that might help transcend the vitriol of partisan political discourse. And I'm curious, on the eve of a presidential inauguration, I guess, what would you prescribe to help the tribe of us?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Wright. And hey, thanks for your great writing. It's the best sports writing in the country, and it's what a real privilege to do this with you. And I'll tell you, I've been really concerned about our country in connection with this polarization that we've seen. How we are, there are these centripetal forces that are just kind of spinning us apart from each other. And I write, as you know, like in the conclusion of the book, where the book is mostly about our strategic competence, right? How we compete more effectively to build a better future for generations to come. I write in the conclusion about our need to restore our confidence in who we are as a people, our common identity as Americans, and confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes. And hey, I think what we've seen in this past year is a real stress test of our democracy, a stress test associated with a quadruple crisis, or a quadruple traumas, I would say, right? A pandemic, now over 400,000 people we've lost, right? A recession associated with a pandemic, social divisions laid bare by George Floyd's murder, and the aftermath, the protests, and the unrest and the concerns, of unequal treatment under the law and inequality of opportunity associated with it, and now this vitriolic partisan political season and this election, and a president who was actually deliberately undermining our confidence in our democratic processes and in our election. Okay, so we had a tragedy last week with the assault on the Capitol, but I'll tell you, I think we have reason to be optimistic. And this is what I write about in the book is we ought to take a minute sometimes to celebrate what we do have, right? Hey, right, we do have a say in how we're governed. We do live in a country with rule of law, and hey, we're imperfect, right? But our founders knew that our republic required constant nurturing, right? From the time of the revolution. So, right, I wanted to write this book so we can come together for meaningful, civil discussions about the challenge we're facing. And the theory behind it, right, is that if we focus on the challenges we're facing abroad and what we have to do to work together to overcome those challenges, that might be a way for us to come together at home, right? Because these shouldn't be partisan issues, right? And so that's my hope for the book.
In the introduction, you reference Hans Morgenthau, who wrote an essay with Ethel Person, and he fled the Nazis in 1937 and was one of the real fathers of international relations, as you write in the book. And if we'll play with the idea for a second that we're flowing from a place where the any leader that you agree or disagree with is a symptom and not the cause, like there's something going on in the culture that has been brewing for a long time. In this essay, in his 1978 essay that you write about the roots of narcissism, is talking about foreign policy when you're preoccupied with self. And I mean, I'm wondering if, as a student of history, if you can go back and see where we started laying tracks to arrive at our current worldview. I mean, like, where would the story of 2019, in your opinion, 2019, 2020, 21 start? Like where was this starting somewhere that we didn't see?
Well, I started really with the end of the Cold War, right? And the way you asked the question reminds me of one of my favorite Clinton quotes. And by Clinton, I mean George Clinton of Parliament Funkadelic, who said, "If you don't like the effects, don't produce the cause." Right? And so what I identify in the book as the cause is strategic narcissism, right? This tendency to define the world only in relation to us, and then assume that what we do is going to be, or what we decide not to do is going to be decisive toward achieving a favorable outcome. And I tell the story of our cavalry regiment patrolling that border near Coburg, Germany, right by Hans Morgenthau's birthplace, where Martin Luther translated the Bible into German, right? And staring down East German border guards one minute, and then the next minute, seeing the gates thrown open, and then tens, and then hundreds, and then thousands, and then tens of thousands of East Germans pouring across the border bearing bouquets of flowers and bottles of wine, and there were hugs and there were tears of joy. Hey, there was reason for optimism. But I think that optimism associated with the end of the Cold War, as the Soviet Union broke apart, the East German government just faded away, and then combined with a lopsided military victory over the fourth largest army in the world. We're on the 30th anniversary of that, by the way, which is kind of crazy. Just yesterday, I think, was the beginning of the air war in the 1991 Gulf War, right? So I'm super old now, man. I'm one of these old veterans, man. I used to see when I was a young guy. And so we were overconfident. And I think that overconfident led to a touch of hubris in the 90s. And we made these assumptions about the post-Cold War period, right? That, hey, an arc of history had guaranteed the primacy of our free and open societies and systems over closed authoritarian systems. That great power competition and rivalry was a relic of the past. And our technological military prowess would guarantee our security way into the future. And hey, right, that was all a setup. That was a setup for some disappointments and strategic shocks in the 2000s. First, the mass murder attacks of 9/11, the most devastating terrorist attacks in history. Hey, they bypassed, right? These terrorists bypassed our technological military prowess with box cutters and airplanes, right? And then we had the long, and costly wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we often want to debate, hey, should we have done it, right? Meaning, should we have invaded, Iraq in 2003? I think we ought to debate who the heck thought it would be easy, right? And why did they think it would be easy? And this shook our confidence along with the 2008, 2009 financial crisis. Now, combine that with transitions in the global economy associated with unchecked globalization, large portions of the American people being left behind by that transition. Hey, toss in an opioid crisis, right?
Yeah.
And you get a crisis of confidence. And the pendulum swung from over optimism and hubris to, I think, pessimism, defeatism, even, and resignation, right? And the belief that we just needed to disengage from these competitions abroad. And so what I argue for in the book is, hey, how about something in between? How about a realistic appraisal of what is at stake? And then what are the strategies that we can employ? Not just military strategies, but overall strategies, right? All elements of our power alongside efforts of like-minded partners to build a better future for generations of Americans to come.
The book is broken into, and people, you really should check this out. If nothing else, you will own every cocktail party you ever go to again, because like, believe me, I'm going to be parroting some of the general's ideas as my own. But you go through, it's Russia, China, South Asia, the Middle East, Iran, and North Korea. So I sort of wanted to roll a little through those to a question or two to touch on them, to allow people to get a sense of what's going on. The name of the book is Battlegrounds, and these are various battlegrounds, obviously, that we are engaged in either directly or, philosophically. In the chapter on Russia, it's interesting where you talked about the Internet Research Agency. I'm wondering if you could describe for people who, might wonder what's real and what's spin, if you could tell people what Russia was actually doing in relation to the 2016 election.
Right. Well, hey, thanks, Ray. So what I try to do in the book is apply, strategic empathy, a term I borrowed from my friend and great historian, Zachary Shore, who's an amazing guy, by the way. Besides being a great historian and written some great books, that he happens to be blind and has overcome his disability in a way that's just phenomenal, But Zach Shore argues for strategic empathy, which argues for paying particular attention to the emotions, the aspirations, and ideology that drive and constrain the other, adversaries and rivals. And we kind of skip that step, and we skip that step with Putin. Hey, what Putin is driven by is a sense of honor lost after the end of the Cold War. And so what he wants to do is restore Russia to national greatness. Hey, but when he checks out the books, and he looks at the size of the Russian economy, it's the size of Texas, right? It's the size of Italy. He can't compete with us head on. So his vision of victory is to drag us down so that he's the last man standing, us being really mainly the United States and Europe. And the way he's doing that is with a campaign, I describe it in the book as disruption, disinformation, and denial, as well as the use of disruptive technologies. I try to use, as you might have noticed, some alliteration in describing these strategies. But the way what he wants to do, right, is he wants to attack our confidence in who we are. Now we're doing a lot of the damage, as I mentioned, ourselves, right? But what he will do is try to widen those gaps, and with the way that they're doing it is with cyber-enabled information warfare against us mainly. And in the 2016 election, that election was part of that sustained campaign of disinformation, and I believe really not to determine who won the election. What he really, really wants to do, and sadly, Donald Trump helped him do this in this past election as well, is not really trying to determine who wins. He doesn't really care who wins, as long as large numbers of Americans doubt the legitimacy of the result and therefore lose confidence in our democratic processes. He also wants to divide us on other issues, mainly of race. So like 80% of this Internet Research Agency, which is a cutout for the FSB and the Russian military intelligence, was on issues of race. 80% of the traffic, issues of race, appropriating really? Sites. Yeah, absolutely. And then a distant second, right, was on immigration, issues of immigration, because those are divisive, and then gun control, right? So hitting all those hot button topics with an effort to polarize us and pit us against each other, right? And I hope that recognizing it can be a force for bringing us back together.
Yeah, because you wrote, I'm on page 53, and I just was like, I had this, there are many moments in here where I was just like, oh, like you synthesize things in such a way that I'm like, oh, I actually instinctively know that that's true, even though I've never thought that before. But when you talked about how the goal of the Kremlin, even within their own country, is to confuse and sow doubt, so that, like, you quote a Russian television producer who identified the goal is the creation of an environment in which people begin, quote, giving up on the facts.
Yeah.
And it feels a little bit like they won, the Kremlin.
I know. Well, I mean, I'll tell you, right. We have a lot of work to do, as I mentioned. All of us do, right? I mean, where are the authoritative sources of information we can go to in the United States now, right? And of course, President Trump created a lot, or he made the problem worse, right, with fake news and everything else. But also, I think the media is doing it to itself as well, and we're helping them, because their business model is successful, right? So how is it, man, that if you lean one direction politically, you watch one cable news station? If you lean the other way, you watch one of two others, right? So we don't even have really a solid basis for coming together for a conversation around a common set of facts, and now we have the growth of the pseudo media that spins out all of these crazy conspiracy theories, and then social media, which is even worse, because the algorithms associated with the business model of getting more and more advertising dollars with more and more clicks shows us more and more extreme content and drives us apart from one another. So, I think the fourth estate, has a lot of work to do. And we have to demand more from journalism overall. But I think your profession, right, is more important than ever, right? And I think a lot of it has been because Donald Trump is such a polarizing person too, and it's easy to understand how he elicits anger and outrage. I think journalism is consumed itself to a certain extent,
Yeah.
based on its anger over Trump and some of his antics.
And it's interesting. I mean, and like I read, somebody was talking to me the other day about how basically the 30 Years' War flowed from the invention of the printing press, and people just weren't prepared for the ability to, like, all of a sudden anyone could say anything they wanted. And it feels like this is one of those interesting moments in history. And before I move on to China, later in the book, this feels connected to this. Later in the book, you talk about when you yourself were the target of the Russia's IRA, which is just weird to say. Sorry, but I'm wondering what that feels like when all of a sudden a huge, sophisticated security machine has decided that you're the flavor of the month.
Yeah. Well, it was the largest orchestrated social media campaign against an individual that had been recorded to that time, and so I took it as a compliment, so it was a coordinated effort, I think, with a combination of witting but mostly unwitting agents across the so-called alt-right, the amorphous political movement associated with the alt-right. And what they do is they try to find any way to discredit a person. And so for me, I was soft on terrorism, even though I had spent many years since 9/11 overseas fighting against terrorists. I was soft on Iran, even though the policy we put in place was was fundamentally different and very I think a very strong policy on Iran, for example. I was anti-Israel. I was fill in the blank. They combine that with slander, all kinds of lies and so forth, and so it mainly operates in this kind of cesspool of social media, is where they can operate unchecked. And these were people like this Alex Jones character, but then also the Pizzagate crowd was all in on it, right? I mean, this is the same, a lot of the same characters, and I'm pretty stoic about this stuff, right? I mean, I've been shot at for real, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I'm just like, okay, bring it on. I don't care. I'm doing my job. And I had a decision to make around that time. This was like August, I guess, of 2017, that I could either focus on that, and get distracted by it, or I could just do my job and let the chips fall where they may, and so I just did my job and try to be, transparent about doing my job. And I think that's one of the ways to get over it. I do think that there is, there have to be some policy, remedies for this, but all of these ideas have a downside, right? I mean, the more you do to kind of try to clean up the cesspool, then who's going to be the arbiter of free speech, right? So, none of these are easy policy decisions. I write about some of these recommendations in the book, but I don't come down really heavy on either side because, frankly, right, I don't know what the right answer is, on how we minimize, the danger associated with social media in particular, without impinging on free speech and freedom of expression.
Well, it's that, it's the Voltaire, like, I disagree with what you say, but will defend to the death your right to say it. I mean, it's sort of like, what's the water's edge on that? I'm not sure anyone has a good answer. I want to talk about China, and, you had a recent op-ed in the Washington Post. I think it was the Washington Post that I read, and want to sort of get to that. First, there's a question here from David Cruz that fits into this. So I was going to ask, and he says, Trump's failure to confront Putin is baffling to David. As an insider, can you explain the president's behavior and willingness to side with Putin over the U.S. intelligence community?
Hey, David, it's baffling to me too, right? So I was gone by the time the Helsinki conference happened, if you remember that, kind of travesty of a press conference. And I was driving cross country with my wife, and she heard me yelling in the yelling in the hotel room, yelling at the television during the Helsinki press conference. I'll tell you, I in the book I try to explain it, right, and I try to explain it really with trying to being clear about how President Trump was wrong to give Putin this ability of what my friend Mark Sedwell calls implausible deniability, right? The ability to get away with it because he gives him space to deny it. But I put it in context of 3 administrations' efforts to have a better relationship with Putin, right? Putin is the best liar, the best manipulator you can imagine. And he holds out this prospect of, hey, we've just been misunderstood. We were treated badly at the end of the Cold War, expansion of NATO, all this other stuff. And President George W. Bush, if you remember, looked into his soul, right? And then Secretary Clinton brought the reset button to Lavrov in Geneva, and President Obama leaned over and said, hey, we'll have more flexibility after the election, and traded off missile defense in Poland in the hope of a better relationship. So what I try to depict is that continuity in continuity that involves really self-deception and self-delusion, right? That Putin is suddenly going to become like the Grinch, right? His heart's going to get 2 sizes bigger. You know what I mean? He's going to be fundamentally different. It's not going to happen. And so what I argue for in the book is the need to impose costs on Russia beyond those that the Kremlin factors in when it takes these aggressive actions, and the poisoning of Navalny is just one of the, and now the arrest of Navalny is one of the latest incidents. But hey, we have to get others to help too. Germany is engaged with this Nord Stream 2 pipeline that is of economic benefit to Russia. It gives Russia coercive power over the German economy. So I think it's time. I think President Biden will be the right person to do this, is to try to galvanize, a response, a transatlantic response, and impose costs on Russia, and maybe impose or convince Putin, that it's in his interest to behave in a more responsible, less confrontational, destructive manner.
Have you ever met him, Putin?
I did.
What's he like?
Well, he's very, he has a false, he affects a false countenance of warmth and engagement. But you can almost see, you can always see him calculating every word he's saying, every phrase for effect, for a manipulative effect. And I mean, that's his tradecraft, right? He's an operator. My friend Fiona Hill wrote a great book on Putin. And the subtitle of the book is, The Operator. And he is a KGB guy through and through, and is a master at manipulation, at posturing and intimidation where he thinks he senses weakness, right? And I think that some people are quite prone to that, to that kind of behavior, and then convincing, playing to people's egos, which some may have noticed that President Trump has one of those, and does enjoy a little bit of affirmation and flattery and so forth. So, he'll use every tool available to him to manipulate and to gain advantage.
You said that, that obviously the Kremlin has costs factored in, and then I promise we're going to go to China, but this is interesting. Andrew Douglas said, if it came to pass that we initiated a full court press on Putin, what might that look like? What are his most vulnerable pressure points?
Yeah. I think the most vulnerable pressure point is the energy sector, right? And Russia's been unable to diversify its economy. It's in a very bad economic situation right now, associated with COVID, the effects on the economy, and a very poor medical response. We've had our own issues, we know, but especially in rural areas, it's been particularly bad for Russia, for Russians. There is already a nascent, opposition movement. You've seen what they've done to stifle any kind of news, even of Navalny, in the main media, and to disparage him. But social media is blowing up, and in terms of pro-Navalny traffic, there were big protests in the eastern part of the country, and then there were protests in Moscow in 2019 associated with the manipulation of municipal elections. So, this was supposed to be a huge year for Putin. It's supposed to be a big victory parade, which they had delayed, but under COVID conditions. And then also the extension of his rule with the rewrite of the Constitution until 2036. So I think the vulnerabilities for him, are really what he's worried about, is kind of a color revolution affecting Russia. And of course, the economic duress that they're under may be bringing that about because of the dissatisfaction of the Russian people. So, I think there's very strong economic leverage. I think the country with their hand on that lever more than any other country is Germany, as I mentioned. And I think with the poisoning of Navalny, him going to Germany, I hope that Germany will maybe generate the will. And by the way, we have part of that solution, which is liquefied natural gas exports. Could help, I think, Germany wean itself off of Russian natural gas, and then we could work together on energy security, renewables, and so forth with Germany. Germany kind of put themselves in a tough spot, energy security wise, because they got rid of all nuclear plants. After the Fukushima disaster, but there are no tsunamis aren't going to come out of the Rhine though. I couldn't really figure that one out. But now they've to go to 100% renewables has been infeasible, and as you know, the biggest greenhouse gas reduction ever, man-made gas reduction, was in the U.S. with the conversion to cheap natural gas. So anyway, I think there's some opportunities to work together to put more pressure on Russia, but also what I stress in the book is maintaining as many positive relationships with Russian leaders who are outside of that immediate circle of Putin's. Because what we really want to do is for Russians to recognize, hey, their futures with Europe and the West, right? That's been our hope, since the early '90s. There have been a series of disappointments. The failure of reforms in the '90s, the failure of Yeltsin's government, Putin's takeover. And what he's done since then. But I think we ought to still play the long game with Russia.
Is, for people who didn't read the China op-ed, I mean, it feels to me like an extension of some of the arguments you were making in the book. I'm curious if you could describe the current administration's China policy, and what do you think that the Biden administration should do with that policy?
Yeah, so I think this is an area where there should be a high degree of continuity, and what I'm concerned about in foreign policy, I read about this in the conclusion, is that if we can't conduct a sustained, right, and relatively consistent approach to some of these enduring challenges, we lose credibility and influence, right? And I think there's been a tendency across recent administrations to define a new administration's foreign policy mainly as an opposition to the administration that came before it. And of course, there's going to be an understandable desire to reject all things Trump, especially what happened in the Capitol. But what I make the case for in the op-ed, and I think the strategy that was declassified last week makes the case, is that we ought to have this approach of transparent competition with the policies and actions, the hostility and aggression of the Chinese Communist Party. And to do that, obviously, with an integrated approach across our government, but also with our private sector and with like-minded partners internationally. And what I write about in the op-ed, it does reflect kind of the content in the book, is that there are three fundamental understandings, about the misunderstandings, about the, so I'll be kind of Chinese about it, right? The three misunderstandings,
Exactly.
and they are, first of all, that, hey, this is a U.S.-China problem, and this is kind of a manifestation of strategic narcissism. I mean, one of the permutations of this is, Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party is acting out just because Donald Trump is so mean to them, right? Well, I mean, if you look at Chinese actions, right, just during COVID, right, bludgeoning Indian soldiers to death on the Indian frontier, more aggression in the South China Sea, extending the party's repressive arm into Hong Kong. They just arrested, 53 rights activists in Hong Kong just last week. The campaign of cultural genocide in Xinjiang, the threats toward Taiwan, massive cyber attacks on our medical research facilities in the midst of a pandemic, the wolf warrior diplomacy, the economic coercion focused on Australia now. Okay, wait, tell me again, how is this a U.S. China problem? And what I think we ought to say is, hey, we're not forcing countries to choose between Washington and Beijing. Countries are facing a choice between sovereignty and servitude, right? And then the second misunderstanding related to this is like, hey, there hasn't been any international cooperation, and again, this is the corollary to that is like Donald Trump is so mean that he just, upset everybody to such an extent that if you hate him enough, you begin to love Xi Jinping. Well, I mean, actually, there has been a lot of international cooperation. There needs to be more. I mean, I think our European friends entering into this economic deal in the past 2 weeks, talk about bad timing, if nothing else, right? In terms of what China's been doing and they get rewarded for it, geez, thanks for that, European Union. We'll see if that passes the European Parliament. It may not. But then we have to build on that international cooperation, but just recognize that, hey, there has been a good deal of international cooperation on the China problem. And then third, this idea, that we face this Thucydides trap, right? That it's a stark choice between acquiescence to the party's agenda or a disastrous war. Well, no, there's plenty of competitive space in between that. And that's why, I highlight this, the declassified document, which I think it's worth people taking a glance over. I think it's a fundamentally sound document, and there are strategies and policies that underlay that document as well.
Flowing out of that, it occurs to me, I mean, this is a strange, broad question, but in your opinion, what is the job of the President of the United States?
Yeah, well, I think his job is to, and we kind of mentioned this in the highly readable December 2017 National Security Strategy of the United States, right? Is to protect and advance America's vital interests, and we define those vital interests in three areas, right? The first is to preserve peace, and I think to do so mainly through strength, through the old-fashioned deterrence by denial, right? Convincing a potential enemy that enemy cannot accomplish their objectives through the use of force or doing damage to Americans and our homeland. And the second key interest is to promote American prosperity, right? We want future generations of Americans to enjoy what previous have enjoyed, but to build on those accomplishments, to achieve real equality of opportunity, and to help more Americans recognize that they can achieve the American dream, build a better future for them and for their children and grandchildren. And then I think the third is to promote American influence, advance American influence. And I'm unabashed about this. I mean, I believe America is a force for good in the world. We're imperfect, as I mentioned in the beginning. We have a lot of work to do. Our republic has always been, a work in progress and required constant nurturing and improvement. But I think we ought to celebrate. Hey, we do have a say in how we're governed. We do live under rule of law. We do enjoy freedom of speech, and we do expect tolerance of diversity and based on race and religion and sexual orientation and so, hey, I think there's a lot that we ought to be proud of, and I think a president ought to help promote, not in like a regime change way, or a neocon way abroad. But recognize that the community of free nations that are committed to kind of universal rights or unalienable rights that enshrined in our Declaration of Independence, that makes the world more prosperous and more safe. right? So I think that's it. I mean, I think the president has a lot to do beyond that, obviously. But I think you expect a president to have a sense of humility, and recognizing that our government serves the people, right, not the other way around. To recognize that the government is not the answer for all of our societal ills, but government should at least not be part of the problem. It should foster solutions. So I think a president should have a sense of our history, should be intellectually curious, should recognize the importance of collaboration and an interdisciplinary approach to complex problems, and that not underestimate how influential he or she is. I think that oftentimes President Trump was behaving in a way that he behaved his whole life, right? I mean, people don't change a whole heck of a lot after age 70,
Yeah.
but I don't think he realized, the effect that his words and behavior sometimes had, especially the negative effects. And I think we saw that in dramatic form in the assault on the Capitol.
Is a couple more things, and we'll get to some questions here. One of my favorite stories in the book, I think I certainly reading the book, especially talking about the Middle East and specifically Afghanistan, just sort of felt like, we've been fighting, to steal Dexter Filkins' book title, but we've been fighting this forever war. And I don't really know what's going on. Like, I mean, you write about in the book that most people don't understand. And you said there's this, and you go on to describe it, but you said, I wish the American people could have heard the briefing from Mick Nicholson's staff that day. And that makes sense in the context of the book. I'm wondering if you could just try to put people in that room, and like allow the couple of dozen American people here to sort of have that experience.
Right. Well, I'll tell you, thanks for this question, because I do think Afghanistan may be the most dramatic example of strategic narcissism in recent years. And in particular, because we've defined the wars we'd like it to be. We've actually conjured up the enemy we would prefer rather than the actual enemy that we're fighting. And what I think is in wartime, in particular, a president has he has a duty and a responsibility to explain two things to the American people. And these are two things that were covered in that briefing that day. First of all, what is at stake, right? What is at stake? Why do the American people care about this fight, right? And why are we committing treasure, but especially the blood of our fellow Americans to this fight? And this is what that briefing brought out. It brought out the fact that we are engaged against enemies of all civilized peoples. These are terrorist organizations that want to commit mass murder against us, use as their principal tactic in a war that aims to establish a caliphate in which they extinguish human freedom, and that they use it as a base to continue their attacks against us, the enemy, who they define as anyone who does not adhere to their perverted interpretation of Islam. And so, so this is a threat we ought to be concerned about. And guess what? Hey, it's not a theoretical case, right? This is what happened on 9/11, is in that same terrorist ecosystem along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border in particular. Groups gained a safe haven and support base that allowed them to gain strength, allowed them to plan, prepare, organize, and finance, with a very lucrative drug trade, by the way, attacks, the most devastating attacks in history. And guess what? It's happened since then, with failed and successful attacks. Remember the failed Times Square bomber, right? He came directly out of that same spot. And why was he not effective? Because he was dodging, our military and intelligence capabilities and was never properly trained, right? So denying the safety and support base, hey, that's a worthy objective, right? So if you understand what is at stake with these 20 or so designated terrorist organizations that I argue in the book, right, are more dangerous today than they were on September 10th, 2001, because they're orders of magnitude larger in numbers. They're connected by communications like they never were before, and they have destructive capabilities that they didn't have before. Then what is the strategy? Hey, Mr. President, whoever the president is, what is the strategy that will deliver a favorable outcome at a cost acceptable to the American people? And this is what American presidents have failed to do in Afghanistan across 2 decades. And this is why I argue that the war in Afghanistan has not been a 20-year-long war. It's been a 1-year war fought 20 times over. And I would say that it wasn't until, August of 2017 when President Trump gave the speech that we had a sustainable and sound approach to the war in Afghanistan. And what concerns me about strategic narcissism applied to war is not only does it make you ineffective in waging war, I think it can make the war unethical, right? Because if you have not defined a just end consistent with St. Thomas Aquinas's, jus in bello theory, then the war is not just. And we oftentimes did not define that end well, and did not implement a strategy to sustain to achieve our objectives and to sustain the outcome. Hey, wars don't end when we leave. I mean, and that's the ultimate strategic narcissism, is to think that whatever you do is going to be decisive. And the theme overall in the book, right, is that, hey, we're not the only people with authorship over our future. Others have agency and exercise authorship as well.
It's I mean, like, I was reading it and was sort of stunned to realize that, Osama bin Laden hated a Sunni family living in Manchester who had United season tickets as much as he hated an Episcopalian from Clarksdale, Mississippi. How have our fundamental misunderstandings of the inner workings of sort of where, Al Qaeda, now ISIS, lives in relationship to Islam around the world affected our misunderstanding of what's happening in Afghanistan?
Well, hey, this is really important, I think, is to recognize that these are not, it was one of the big arguments I got in the White House, because I don't want to call them Islamic terrorists, because I think that these are irreligious murderers, right, who use criminal activity, murder in particular, to advance a political agenda, right? And why give them? Why allow them to cloak themselves in the false legitimacy of religion? It's also worth pointing out that the vast majority of their victims are fellow Muslims, right? So this is a war of all humanity, right, against these criminals and terrorists and murderers. So I think that's one element of fundamental misunderstanding. I think the other misunderstanding today in Afghanistan is, I mentioned, we conjured up the enemy we'd prefer, right? So we drew a bold line, between the Taliban and Al Qaeda. Hey, that bold line doesn't exist. These organizations are intertwined. Sometimes they're in tension with each other. Sometimes they fight each other, but they share people, they share resources, they share expertise. Sometimes they share funding from organizations. The Taliban regenerated after the initial successful military campaign in Afghanistan with the help of Al Qaeda and the Pakistani Army's intelligence arm, right? So we oversimplify the conflict as, the Taliban. Now we've actually rehabilitated the Taliban in our minds, right? It's almost as if we're advocating for power sharing with the Taliban. Hey, what the heck does that look like, right? Is that mass executions in the soccer stadium every other Saturday? Yeah. Is that every other girls' school bulldozed, right? And so we're seeing it play out in Afghanistan now. And by the way, this is, I believe, the most underreported war in history. I mean, how many people know the attacks that the Taliban has continued to conduct against the Afghan people, against innocents, even as these negotiations continue after we set up the Afghan government for failure, right? We made all these concessions. We made them release 5,000 of some of the most heinous people on earth to reconstitute the Taliban, and then we left them at a table with the Taliban, who were looking at them across the table and saying, "Hey, what am I talking to you for? We just defeated the world's greatest superpower, and so we're going to dictate the terms." So, I mean, you can tell I'm upset about this, right? But, I think that, I hope the Obama administration provides a corrective. I'm not super optimistic about it, because that had been the Obama administration policy. In many ways, the flaws of the Trump administration policy were doubling down on the flaws in the Obama administration policy. So I'm concerned about it. I'm concerned for the Afghan people. This is going to be a humanitarian crisis of colossal scale, potentially. And also it could destabilize the region. By the way, also associated with these stakes is the fact that Pakistan's a nuclear armed country, and instability in Afghanistan could easily bleed over into Pakistan.
General, there are a couple more questions, and then actually I see Beckett right there. There's one, and this is, I think actually this is the one we should end on, because this is, I have no idea what you're going to say to this. Does General McMaster believe the greatest threat to our democracy is internal or external, and why?
Yeah. The greatest threat to our democracy is internal. Now, I don't think it is a grave or impending threat, but it's a serious threat. And we have a lot of work to do on it. I mentioned, in the conclusion, what we can all do to strengthen our democracy. Hey, right, I believe, that it's forums like this, where, virtually we come together for discussions about the issues that we're facing. Man, I think that once we can do it, we have to come together physically. We have to read your book and become connoisseurs of bourbon together, man. And I think, I think that every one of us are members of communities. Now is the time to convene our communities. I have the great gift of working on a college campus with amazing people, amazing young people, who have a strong desire to serve, who do want to empathize with one another, who do want to break this cycle of this interaction of identity politics and bigotry and racism that's pulling us apart from each other, right? To be tolerant of people's views, right? To respect one another. I think we can all have a big impact. And, I write about this in the book, that this has to happen, on basketball courts and on rugby pitches, and tailgates, at football games. And I just think that we have to get back to that. And then also the other emphasis is on education, right? I think everybody needs to hug a teacher, right now. I think a lot of parents who have school-age kids at home, they appreciate teachers more than ever. But I think we have to reinvigorate civics education. And as I mentioned earlier, a sense of our history, right? Who we are as Americans and what our historical experience has been, to recognize that, the great promise of America, the great accomplishments of America, as well as the shortcomings and what we have to work on. So, that's the last word I'd like to have to say is, hey, we all have a say in this, right? And we ought to take a minute. As I mentioned, take a minute to be grateful for the fact that we're not in China, right? That we do have a say in how we're governed. That, hey, and again, as in the words of George Clinton, right? If you don't like the effects, don't produce the cause. Or another great George Clinton quote that I would mention is, free your mind and your ass will follow. So I think, that's why I love the opportunity to be with all of you, and especially this group that comes together for these kind of discussions.
They're not going to kick you out of the General Club for quoting George Clinton?
Hey, man, I think, I didn't mention this, but I think funkiness is a critical element of national security. We can talk about that sometime.
All right. All right. And with that, we'll end the event. Thanks so much to HR McMaster and Wright for doing this. That was a great conversation. And thank you all to the attendees for coming. Yeah, that was excellent.
Thanks, Beckett. Thanks so much to you. Thanks to Wright, and congratulations, Beckett.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.